I remember that night so clearly, as if it were still happening. The air was cold, with a metallic taste, and the sky was heavy, like rusty iron. The city was awake, but it seemed empty. Cars that usually honked now glided past us silently, as if sensing trouble. I sat in the ambulance, hunched over my knees, trying to finish my cold coffee when the dispatcher reported a new call. A shootout in the industrial zone. 2 wounded, 1 in serious condition, the voice said mechanically. I knew that address. I had been there before. A warehouse, a back entrance, brick walls with peeling graffiti. There were no random passers-by there, only locals, and strangers, who were quickly pushed out onto the street. I felt my heart quicken. Professionally, it shouldn't have mattered. An address is just an address. A patient is just a patient. But inside, a wave of anxiety rose. Not just the usual adrenaline rush before a call, but something else. The siren wailed, and our van sped through the sleeping city. Red lights flashed on the empty facades of buildings, reflected in puddles, pulling the faces of random passers-by out of the darkness. I looked out the window and felt reality changing. It was as if the city had turned into a chessboard, and we were pieces being moved by someone else's hands. When we arrived, everything looked just as I had imagined. Cars with smashed windows, blood on the asphalt, pieces of glass, police tape. I heard someone scream, then a short siren. My partner and I ran out of the car, carrying toolkits, syringes, and gloves. He was lying a little away from the others. A young man, strong, with harsh features, as if carved from stone. His hands were covered in blood, his jacket soaked through. I crouched down next to him, put my knee on the cold asphalt, and smelled a mixture of gunpowder, sweat, and expensive cologne. He was alive. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to know everything about me. I didn't have time to think. I just acted. I took out my gloves, checked his breathing and pulse, and stopped the bleeding. His hand squeezed mine, not like a patient, but like a man who wanted to live at any cost. I felt the cold metal on his fingers, a trace of the weapon he had probably been holding a minute ago. The thought flashed through my mind. He's dangerous. But I kept working. The siren blared again, and we lifted him onto the stretcher. Everything was like 100 other cases, but not inside me. Inside, everything had changed. I memorized his face the way you memorize the details of a dream, so that later I could check if he was real. I knew I would never forget that look. In the ambulance, I sat opposite him, setting up N4 and administering painkillers. He was breathing heavily, but rhythmically. The city outside the windows turned into blurred streaks of light, and it seemed as if we were both floating inside a tunnel where there was no past and no future, only this journey. I felt 2 worlds colliding inside me. My familiar one, where I save people, and his, where people kill. When we handed him over to the emergency room, he looked at me again. I caught that look like a person catches a coin thrown into a fountain. No words, no gestures, just a look. But it was that look that stayed with me. I left the hospital and breathed in the night air. It seemed as if the city had changed. I walked to the ambulance and felt my legs turning to jelly. It seemed like a normal night, a normal call. But inside me, a new reality was growing. I knew that this man would enter my life as suddenly as the siren had broken into it, and that from now on, my hands, accustomed to saving lives, had touched something that could destroy me. I returned to the car, took off my gloves, and threw them in the trash. The smell of blood lingered on my fingers. I rubbed my hands with a napkin, but the smell wouldn't go away. I looked at my palms and thought, from this night on, they are different. My days begin in a grey hallway where lamps hum and the smell of bleach hangs in the air. I check the dressings, ampoules, and batteries, as if that will give me control over the night. The work is mechanical. Bandages, catheters, a short sleep. But after that night, a sound settled inside me, barely audible, calling me back to where I once held a cold hand. We respond to calls. The city is divided by smells. In the center, coffee and tiles. On the outskirts, sand, iron, and gasoline. I catch these smells because they are more honest than words. I recognize the smell of gunpowder instantly. Its cologne comes to mind, like cold water running through my veins. I tell myself that these are just associations, but the body reacts faster than the mind. Patients come and go. A woman afraid of stairs, teenagers with cut eyebrows, a porter with a back spasm. I wash wounds, apply bandages, fix electrodes. I cling to routine like a handrail. Sometimes I am grateful for simple injuries. They are treatable, understandable, not beckoning with their darkness. Night falls quickly. The siren sounds different, touching an invisible chord. I feel his world spinning nearby, like two balls that sometimes touch and spark. I fear this spark and await it at the same time. Towards morning, the city is gentler. Street cleaners sweep away the night. People go to work. I take off my stethoscope, wash my hands longer than necessary, and still smell blood and iodine. I repeat the mantra about boundaries and profession, but I know the night will return to me, and with it, the memory of a look that I cannot. The city began whispering about me and him before I realized that I had become part of this story. At first, it was brief mentions in conversations among colleagues, hints, half-words, glances that lingered longer than they should have. Then I began to hear people whisper his name, as if afraid to disturb something that could turn against them. I caught these sounds like a person catches a radio signal, intermittently, but clearly enough to understand the content. I already knew more about him than an emergency doctor should. Police reports became my morning reading. I pieced together chains of events, noted dates, compared addresses. A map of the city gradually formed in my head, not by streets, but by the traces he left behind. It felt like I was looking at a subway map, only instead of stations, there were shootouts, deals, disappearances. Every morning, when I walked into the hospital, I felt people's eyes on me. It seemed to me that everyone knew that I was the one who had saved him. Not just a patient, but a leader whose name was whispered. I walked down the corridor, the floor lit by lamps, and inside me a shadow grew, casting an ever longer silhouette on the walls. I continued to visit his room. Now it was like a ritual. I entered, the smell of medicine, plastic, and through it all, a faint trail of cologne that would not disappear. He lay motionless, his eyes half closed, but I knew he could hear every movement, every word. The room was quiet, like before a storm, and that silence drew me in deeper than I wanted it to. Sometimes, while I was changing his bandages, I would catch something new in his face. Fatigue, emptiness, longing. I thought about how there was no place for this fatigue in the legends about him, how legends like to turn people into symbols. But I saw skin, wounds, bruises. I tried to remain neutral, but my hands remembered how his hand had squeezed them that night, and the memory would not let go. People I didn't know began to appear in the hospital corridors. They walked past, leaving behind the smell of tobacco and expensive fabrics. They didn't look at me, but they were there, like a backdrop, like invisible guards. I could feel them assessing my work, not as a doctor, but as a possible source of information. I learned not to meet their gaze, to keep my back straight, to keep my hands steady. Sometimes, when I left after my shift, I would walk through the hospital courtyard and see his car. Dark, shiny, with tinted windows. It stood quietly, like a sign that he was alive and that something was keeping me at a distance. I walked past, pretending not to notice, but inside I felt a tightening. The city around me became an extension of that car, its people, its world. At night I dreamed of maps, streets, lines, dots, ambulance routes that intersected with his roads. I woke up and realized that the legends about him were not just words, but a web in which I was already entangled. I tried to convince myself that it was just work, but I knew it was more than that. During those days, I began to notice that even familiar sounds, sirens, footsteps, the ringing of the telephone, sounded different. They began to remind me of his breathing, his pulse, his presence. The city was the same, but now it had a second layer. I walked the same streets as before, but I felt a different surface under my feet. Fragile, slippery, like ice. With each passing day, He became less like a patient and more like the axis around which my life slowly revolved. The legends about him, the whispers, the glances, all of this became part of my routine, just like bandages and antiseptic. And I realized that the story that began in sirens and blood had now penetrated my breath, my dreams, my body. In the evening, leaving the hospital, I walked along the sidewalk and saw my reflection in the shop windows. The reflection seemed thinner than I am, as if I were gradually disappearing. I felt like a person walking down a corridor with the walls around me getting higher and higher. Urban legends surrounded me like water surrounds someone who has forgotten how to swim. I walked home and thought, maybe legends are always dangerous not because of what they say about others, but because of what they do to us. The morning began like hundreds of others. The noise of the elevator, the smell of cheap coffee, the hallway where I checked my balance. But now there was a heaviness growing inside me. Not physical, but the kind that sits in your solar plexus like a stone. I knew that every shift I worked was now more than just a job. It was a step along a tightrope between my life and his world. I still came to his room, still took his blood pressure, checked his stitches, and changed his bandages. It all looked like a ritual, but it felt like a test. I made every movement slowly and precisely, as if not only his health depended on it, but also my ability to remain on this side of the border. I could feel him getting better. His breathing became deeper, his movements more confident, his gaze firmer. He was gradually returning to himself, while I was moving further and further away from my former self. It was a paradox. The stronger he became, the weaker my boundaries became. I tried to keep up a professional facade. I told myself, he's just a patient. You're a doctor. Period. But my body didn't believe it. Every time I changed his bandages, I felt the tension running through my hands like an electric current. With each passing day, he was getting closer to the door, and I was getting deeper into his story. My colleagues whispered. I caught snippets of phrases. Her patient. The one. I pretended not to hear, but my heart grew cold. I didn't want to be seen as connected to him, but I already felt that connection myself. It was like a secret agreement. I saved him, and he took a part of me without asking permission. I began to notice how my hands had become more cautious than before. With other patients, my movements were quick and confident. With him, they were gentler, more attentive, almost intimate. I knew it was wrong. But this caution was stronger than my control. After my shift, I walked home because I couldn't stand the crowded bus. I walked through the streets, and every corner seemed familiar. I looked at the shop windows, signs, and streetlights and thought that the city was a chessboard. He was one piece, I was another, and each of our moves changed the position of all the others. I knew he wasn't innocent. I read the news, saw the reports, and understood that his name was associated with blood, money, and fear. I knew that my duty was to keep my distance, that I mustn't cross the line. But inside me, it all didn't fit into a clear pattern. He was a living person whom I had saved, and there was something about this person that drew me to him like a magnet. In the evening, I sat at home by the window, looked at the city lights, and tried to breathe deeper. I thought about how saving a person's life means involuntarily becoming part of their destiny. That there is no sterile line between helping and getting involved. I imagined a thin thread connecting us, me at one end, him at the other. And this thread was getting thicker every day. There was a struggle inside me. On the one hand, there was duty, rules, and profession. On the other, there was the feeling that he was pulling out a part of me that I had long hidden. I tried to extinguish this feeling, like a surgeon extinguishes a flame in the operating room, but it flared up again. I caught myself starting to make excuses. He's human too. He has a right to life. He has a right to treatment. These phrases sounded logical, but behind them lay something else. I want him to be in my life, at least in this way. And that something else scared me the most. I started talking less with my colleagues. I withdrew into myself, into my work, into monotonous activities. It seemed that if I did everything perfectly, it would give me the right to make mistakes in my personal life. But that was self-deception. No amount of professional perfection could change the fact that inside I had already chosen sides. I just hadn't admitted it to myself. There were rumors in the hospital corridors that he would soon be discharged. My heart sank at this news. It meant that my time with him was coming to an end. But it also meant that now there would be no hospital wall between us. And that thought was both attractive and frightening. On the day I left after my shift, the city seemed especially noisy. The cars honked louder, the lights shone brighter, and the smell of gasoline was heavier. I walked and thought that every road I was walking on was a road to a choice. I knew that soon I would have to decide whether to stay in my role or cross the invisible line. I reached my house, closed the door, and leaned my back against it. My chest felt empty and heavy at the same time. I closed my eyes and saw his face, his scars, his gaze. And I realized that I had not been free for a long time. That my choice would not be between yes and no, but between too late and too late. After that shift, I didn't go home right away. Something inside me was trembling like a thin string, and I wanted to exhale that tension before closing the door to my apartment. I left the hospital, breathing in the cold air, and walked to where the city changed. During the day, these were streets with bus stops, stalls, and children. In the evening, they were a network of passageways where the walls darkened, the windows glowed red, and behind every turn there was silence. I walked slowly, feeling the rough, damp asphalt under my feet, and heard my footsteps echoing those of strangers. The lights of cars were reflected in the shop windows. The wind pulled at my hair like threads. It felt like I was back in the ambulance, but now without the uniform, without the seatbelts, without the siren. Just me and the city, quietly testing my boundaries. In the darkness, the faces of passers-by were like masks. A quick movement of the eyes, a hand in a pocket, a short step, a slight glance back. I felt like I had fallen into a strange time of day, the one that begins when the work shifts are over and the night shifts have not yet begun. It was a territory where any little thing could be a signal, a glance, a movement, a smell. His image floated into my head. I tried to push it away, but it kept coming back, like background noise. I thought about his hands, his scars, how he lay on the stretcher, how he breathed, how he looked at me. I knew he was alive, that somewhere nearby he had his own network, his own streets, his own people. And I walked these streets as if I were trying on someone else's skin. The city smelled different at night. Asphalt and gasoline mixed with the damp rust of old garages, the cloying sweetness of cheap fast food, tobacco from backyards. The wind carried snippets of conversation that disappeared with every step I took. Signals mingled, someone's laughter, the sound of a phone, a short cry, the sound of a bottle hitting concrete. It was all like the pulse of the city, uneven, intermittent. I caught myself knowing where it was more dangerous to cross the street, where the cameras didn't work, where the lights flashed more often. This knowledge appeared imperceptibly, like a scar from a needle prick that you only see weeks later. I understood, a little more, and I would cease to be a stranger in this world. I would begin to find my bearings in it. And that thought frightened me the most. At the intersection, I stopped and looked at the water gathering in a puddle by the curb. The water was black as oil, reflecting the light of the red traffic light. It seemed to me like a mark, a kind of warning. I remembered my night calls. All this time, I thought I was saving people from the darkness. But maybe I was slowly sinking into it myself. I walked on, trying to breathe more evenly. I heard footsteps behind me, or did I imagine it? And hunched my shoulders. At night, the city was like a foreign organism. The streets were arteries, the cars were cells, the windows were eyes. It breathed with me, and it seemed to me that it recognized me. At the end of the street, a 24-hour store glowed. I went in, took some water, stood in line between two men arguing about a football game, and felt like a ghost. No one looked at me, but I felt a gaze on my back. Long, slippery, invisible. I paid and left. I realized that I didn't feel the usual fatigue after my shift. My body felt light, but inside I felt heavy. I walked like someone who knows that they are not expected at home, but somewhere further away. A void arose in my chest, similar to hunger. But it was not hunger for food. It was hunger for presence. I knew he was somewhere nearby, that his world ran parallel to mine. Maybe he was driving in a car with tinted windows. Maybe he was looking at the same streets from the window. Maybe he was planning something I didn't even want to know about. This thought pulled me like a magnet. When I finally reached my street, the sky was beginning to lighten. Street cleaners were sweeping away the night's debris, and the first buses were running empty. I climbed the stairs, put the key in the lock, and felt my hands trembling. I went in, closed the door, and stood in the dark for a long time. I understood that my shifts and these walks afterwards were not just a habit. They were a way to check where I still belonged. I was like a person walking along the edge of a map to see how far they could go. And each time, that edge moved further away. Lying in bed, I closed my eyes and realized that this night would stay with me, just like the others. The city now lived inside me just as I lived inside it. There was no longer a wall between us. Only a thin membrane that I was breaking more and more often. The morning began with the sensation of a foreign voice inside my head. Words from police reports, snippets of colleagues' conversations, names of neighborhoods, everything merged into a single stream. I was reading the news on my phone on my way to work when I saw a familiar date and address. My fingers froze over the screen. A shootout. The same neighborhood where I once saved him. The news was as short as a gunshot. I reread it 3 times, but the meaning didn't change. I walked to the hospital with a lump in my throat. The corridors were just as long, smelled of the same bleach, but now seemed like the set of a different movie. I understood. My work was no longer separate from his world. I entered the ward, and the news played in my head. I saw his scars, and before my eyes were photographs from the scene of the shooting. I checked his pulse, and felt my heart drop like an elevator. He lay in the ward, calm and collected. It was as if he knew that I knew, and he silently accepted my presence. I treated his stitches, changed his bandages, and noted in his chart, temperature normal, blood pressure steady. Everything looked like a routine examination. But inside me, his every breath turned into a question. I could no longer see him as just a patient. The information in the reports was too specific. There were dates, weapons, names. I knew that he had given the order that led to the shootout. I knew that the people who were brought to the intensive care unit that night were there because of him. I knew, and I kept coming. I remembered the first time I held his hand. How I felt the cold metal left over from the weapon. Back then, I thought he was a victim. Now I understood that he was the cause. This discovery opened up a space inside me that I had never looked into before. It was dark there, like a deep well. I began to feel a strange state within myself, a mixture of disgust and attraction. It was as if my brain was pulling me back to protect me, and my body was pulling me forward to look danger in the eye. I knew it wasn't love or pity. It was addiction. I was like a doctor who had started taking his own medicine. In the corridors, I now heard not just footsteps, but signals. I saw people I hadn't noticed before exchanging glances. I realized that the hospital was not just a hospital. It was a meeting point for different worlds. White coats and black suits, sterile instruments and dirty money. I walked down that corridor as if it were a bridge, and I felt the water beneath me. In the evening, when I left after my shift, the city seemed sharper. The streetlights were too bright, and the car windows reflected my eyes. I walked down the street and remembered every little detail. How he lay, how he looked, how he breathed. I asked myself, why am I still here? The answer was simple and frightening. Because something inside me wants to see this story through to the end. I stopped sharing with my colleagues. I stopped writing to my friends. My phone became as heavy as a brick. I locked myself in the bathroom to be in silence. But even there I could hear the echo of sirens. I thought that I had crossed an invisible line. Not in my actions, but in my knowledge. When you know too much, you are already inside. One night, I dreamed of a city I had known since childhood. It was flooded with red light, as if on an emergency call. I was walking through it in a white coat, surrounded by faceless people. They looked at me as if I were a judge. But I knew that it was not they who were judging, but I myself. I woke up feeling like my skin had become thinner. I realized I had to make a choice. Should I remain a doctor who saves everyone without asking questions? Or admit that one day my help to someone could cost the lives of others? This choice was not abstract. It was like a syringe in my palm. Concrete, cold, sharp. When I came back to him that day, he was already sitting on the bed, dressed, with his things packed. His gaze was clear, calm, heavy. I checked the stitches, said the usual words, recorded the readings. Outside everything looked the same, but inside I knew, this scene was the last in this ward. I went out into the corridor and washed my hands. The water was cold, the soap slippery. I looked at my palms and thought, these hands saved people, but now they are like a bridge between two worlds. I dried them with a towel, but I felt that a trace remained. On the way home, I walked slowly, as if time had slowed down. Each step felt heavy in my chest. The city was alive, buzzing, moving, but inside I was empty, like an ford drip after the last drop. I realized that I was facing a choice that had not been spoken aloud, but had already been made inside. That night became a point of no return. I knew that from that moment on, there was no before and after. There was only the road I was already on. And it didn't lead to a place of salvation. It led to a place where I would learn the price of every life saved. After he was discharged, the hospital seemed to stop breathing. The ward where he had been lying became empty so abruptly, as if someone had turned off the sound. The window still looked out onto the courtyard. The curtains fluttered in the wind. The ford drip hung like an empty rod, but now it was just a room. I went back there several more times, supposedly to check on something, but really just to gaze at the white sheets. Nothing had changed except one thing. He was gone. When a patient leaves, the work and the memories usually leave with them. But this time, the memories remained. They settled in my body, in my fingers, in my chest, in my breath. I walked through the corridors and saw his shadow around every corner. It seemed as if his cologne still hung in the air. Even the drops of iodine smelled different, as if reminding me of his skin. My shifts became quieter but harder. I gave injections, changed bandages, listened to hearts, and caught myself comparing every beat to his. I saw new patients, but their faces showed the features of one. I caught snippets of other people's conversations and heard his name in them, even when it wasn't there. I began to notice the city differently. Streets that had previously seemed like mere routes now looked like a map of his presence. Streetlights, signs, courtyards, all of these were markers that could be used to trace an invisible trajectory. He became like a shadow on my path. Intangible, but setting the rhythm. At night, I woke up to the dull sound of tires outside the window. Every car seemed to be the one, dark, with tinted windows. I got up, went to the window, looked down, but the street was empty. I lay back down, but sleep did not return. One question spun in my head. What would happen next? Sometimes I would walk home after my shift along the same streets where I had once felt his presence. Now it had become a ghost, not a mystical one, but a real one, a collection of places, smells, and sounds that had been left without their owner. The city behaved as if someone had disappeared, but its system was still working. I stopped talking to my colleagues about anything personal. They saw me as the same nurse as before, but I felt like an empty corridor with strangers walking through it. I tried to fill the void with work, but it spread like water on the floor. In the evenings, I sat by the window and looked at the lights. My mind was spinning. I had saved a man who might not have deserved to be saved. I became a bridge between two worlds. Now the bridge is empty, but the feeling of weight remains. I knew that somewhere he was continuing to live his life. Meetings, deals, streets, people. I knew that he might never remember my name again. But he remained inside me, like a sting that won't go away. I felt that this trace was not just a memory, but a new starting point. The city became my mirror. Work during the day, streets at night, a short sleep in the morning. Between that, silence. This silence became louder than words, louder than sirens, louder than footsteps. It was like a signal you hear even when the radio is off. I understood. My life had split in two. Before him, there was the rhythm of shifts. After him, there was the rhythm of waiting. It became my internal background noise, like the hum of equipment in a hospital ward. I walked the streets and felt that this story was not over yet, even if he was not there. I learned to live in this silence, as if it were a new reality. I stopped looking for answers because the answers did not fill the void. I just went on duty, saw patients, came home, and waited. I don't know for what. Maybe a phone call, maybe a chance encounter, maybe just the moment when the ringing inside would stop. But the ringing did not go away. I finished my night shift with a feeling of emptiness in my chest. The shift went almost smoothly. Injections, bandaging, running through the corridors. But inside, there was a constant ringing, like the silence before thunder. I left through the back entrance, where there is usually no one except for the orderlies smoking. There was no one there. Only a car. Dark, shiny, with tinted windows, as if the night itself stood on wheels. The engine purred quietly, like a cat. I stopped. My heart skipped a beat. The door opened slightly. A familiar smell wafted out. Leather, cologne, a hint of tobacco. I knew that smell. It was him. I heard no greeting, no name. Only that smell and that look. Through the crack where the streetlights were reflected. The look was not a question, but a statement. You knew this moment would come. I took a step, slowly, like someone approaching the water's edge to check if it's cold. I took a second step, and found myself at the car. Inside, the soft screen of the navigator glowed, and wordless music played softly. He sat behind the wheel, his hands on the leather, his gaze fixed on me. I saw that he was different. His scars had healed, his face had become sharper, his eyes calmer. I felt the city around us dissolve, as if only this car interior remained. I sat down, the door closed quietly, like a breath. The world outside disappeared. The car moved gently, and I realized I hadn't asked where we were going. I didn't want to know. The road glided beneath the wheels. Streetlights, signs, the occasional passerby. Everything turned into a ribbon that slowly unraveled. He didn't say a word, and neither did I. Words would have been too crude for what was happening. I felt his presence nearby, like you can feel the warmth of a lamp even with your eyes closed. I looked out the window and saw the city I once knew by heart. Now it seemed different. This wasn't an ambulance route, but a map of his world. He drove confidently, without looking at the navigation system. I understood. This was his territory, his time, his rules. Something melted in my chest. All the months I had walked the corridors, keeping myself under control, holding my breath, all of that was now dissolving. My body remembered his rhythm, like it remembers music. We drove for a long time. No streetlights witnessed us. No cameras seemed threatening. I thought, this is it, the return. Not even to him, but to myself, to the part of me that I had suppressed, but which had been whispering all this time. Let's go. He stopped the car on the empty embankment. The water was black as oil. The city lights reflected in it in stripes. He looked at me, with a look that was both an invitation and a confession and a question. I took a breath. It seemed to me that this breath lasted a lifetime. I knew this trip was no accident. It wasn't just a ride home after work. It was the moment when two lines merged into one. I could have gotten out of the car and gone home, back to my shifts, to bandages, to my cautious life. But I stayed seated. I looked at him and felt that there would be words, or a touch, or silence. It didn't matter. What mattered was that we were already in the same car. That he had arrived. That I had gotten in. That this was our shared bridge, beyond which there would be no before and after. I put my hands on my knees so they wouldn't shake. I looked at the water and listened to the silence. And I realized, everything that had happened before had led to this. We sat in the car on the waterfront. and the city around us seemed like a backdrop. The sounds became muffled, the light softer, the air denser. It felt like we were both inside an invisible dome, where time stretched out like a drop of oil on water. He turned off the engine, and the silence became louder than any motor. I felt his presence like the warmth that comes from a stove even when it is turned off. He sat next to me, turned slightly toward me, and I knew he was looking at me. I felt his gaze on my skin, my neck, my hands. It was not just attention, but a touch without hands. I looked out the window, but my eyes kept returning to his reflection in the glass. The scars on his face now looked not like traces of pain, but like a pattern that made him stronger. I felt a warmth rising inside me that had nothing to do with fear or shame. It was the very thing I had been suppressing all these months, and now it was coming out. He reached out and touched my wrist. Not abruptly, but slowly, as if checking to see if I would disappear. His fingers were warm, his skin slightly rough. This gesture broke through the wall I had built between professional and woman. All my self-defense, built of bandages, gloves, and ethics, crumbled like fragile glass. I took a deeper breath. The air became thicker. My heart was beating so loudly that I could feel it in my temples. He ran his finger along my wrist, then up to my elbow, and the path was like a spark running along a wire. I knew that if he touched me again, there would be no turning back. I turned to him. We looked into each other's eyes. His gaze was firm, but deep down there was something vulnerable, something he didn't show to anyone. I saw gratitude, desire, doubt, all at once, in that gaze. I knew that if I didn't say it now, I never would. The words came out on their own. That all these months he had been with me, even if not by my side. That I thought about him when I bandaged other people's hands. That I heard his breathing in the sirens. That I could no longer be just a doctor. I spoke in a whisper, but every word was like an open wound. He leaned closer. Our foreheads almost touched. His hand rested on the back of my head, the other on my shoulder. Not a grab, but support, as if he were holding me so I wouldn't fall. I closed my eyes, and the world became warm. It wasn't a kiss, not yet. It was that moment when two bodies stand on the edge of attraction and know they will take the step. When his lips touched my temple, everything inside me lit up. It wasn't like in the movies, not a sudden rush, but a slow, deep warmth, like a fire that ignites from a spark. I felt his breath on my skin, his fingers on the back of my head. Every millimeter of my body began to hear this rhythm. I didn't know how long the silence lasted. Maybe a second, maybe an eternity. But at that moment, I realized that he was as afraid as I was. He was afraid of losing this moment, this opportunity. We were both people who were used to surviving, not living. And now, for the first time, we were choosing to live. I opened my eyes and said almost silently, "I'm with you." He looked at me as if those 3 words were more than a vow. I felt his hand squeeze mine tighter, and that strength was as soft as water. We didn't rush into each other's arms. We didn't hurry. We just sat there, breathing, holding each other. But I knew that everything that had come before was over. Now we were together, and it was no longer a game. It was a decision made without words, but stronger than any promise. After that night in the car, the world was divided into before and after. I woke up in the morning in my apartment, looked at the familiar walls, listened to my neighbors behind the partition, and realized, this is no longer my life. Everything seemed like a theatrical set, a mug on the table, a bathrobe on a hook, a stethoscope in the closet. It was as if I was playing a role I had written for myself, but the script had already been burned. I did everything right at work, but inside I already knew, these were my last days. I looked at my colleagues, their quick movements, their familiar jokes, and felt that I was on the other side of the glass with them. They talked about plans, shifts, salaries, and I heard the hum of the engine of the car in which he was waiting for me. With each shift, I understood more and more clearly. I had already made my choice. Not out loud, not with a gesture, but inside. It was as if I had stepped onto the edge of the bridge, but still had one foot on dry land. This bridge was thinner than a hair, but it was the one I was walking on to become a new me. I began to notice how my hands were no longer medical and foreign. They became mine, warm, alive, eager. I felt energy in them not only for bandaging, but also for action. I stopped being afraid of it. Fear was replaced by a strange calmness, like that of a person who has already made a decision. In the evenings, I walked the streets longer than necessary, as if I wanted to remember every detail of my former life. A lamppost with a bent shade, a wall with peeling paint, a creaking turnstile at the entrance to the subway. It all seemed like a farewell glance at the city I knew as a doctor, and now I would see as part of another reality. There was no heroism inside. There was no romance. There was a feeling of precise movement, like when you insert a needle into a vein. Don't shake, don't rush, get it right. I knew that by leaving the hospital, I was losing not only my job, but also the previous version of myself. I wrote a transfer request. The paper was lying on the manager's desk when I walked out into the corridor. The corridor still smelled of iodine and bleach, but now that smell was not mine. I walked slowly, feeling the past dissolve with each step I took down the stairs. He was waiting for me. The car was parked at the far exit, just like last time. I opened the door and got in without saying a word. We drove off. The city outside the window rushed by, lights flashing, windows whizzing past. I had a stethoscope in my bag, my last symbol of that life. I held it as we drove, my fingers gradually loosening their grip. He drove as calmly as he had then. We were silent. But there was no emptiness in that silence. There was something like an acknowledgement. He knew I had made my choice. I knew he knew. It was not a proposal, not a request, but the movement of two rivers that had finally converged into one. We stopped at a house I knew nothing about. High walls, security guards, closed gates. I got out of the car, breathed in the night air, and felt that I was stepping into new territory. I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a person who had walked through a door. He turned around, his gaze firm but soft at its core. And in that gaze there was neither victory nor scrutiny. There was only a calm acknowledgement. You are here. You are with us. You are with me. I nodded. That was my answer. That evening, I left my stethoscope on his desk. I just put it down and went into another room. I didn't need a conversation or a promise. This gesture was clearer than words. I am no longer a doctor. I am now part of his life. I looked in the mirror in my new room. My face was the same, but my gaze was different. There was no confusion in it. Only a clear understanding that I had crossed the line I had thought about so much. And that line turned out not to be scary. It was scary before it. Afterwards, there was silence, like after a thunderstorm. I lay down on the bed, feeling the walls of the house holding the heat. I heard his footsteps somewhere nearby, calm and confident. And for the first time in many months, I fell asleep without a siren in my head. At first, everything felt like a waking dream. I woke up in a house with high windows, where the air smelled of coffee and leather instead of bleach and iodine. My days no longer began with racing through hospital corridors or checking emergency kits. Now I watched him conduct negotiations, meet people, allocate money and words as precisely as I once allocated medications. I didn't become his girlfriend or his secret. I became part of the system. At first I simply translated medical terms, helped with injuries. Later I learned to see the patterns, the connections, the people. I stopped being a witness and became a participant. Fear faded, and knowledge took its place. We hardly ever spoke about our feelings, yet they were in every gesture. His hand at my waist, my glance across the table, our breathing in the same room. Passion and trust fused into one, quiet but solid, like the concrete beneath our feet. We were no longer strangers. Sometimes at night we climbed up to the roof. The city lay below us, strewn with lights. He talked about his plans. I talked about my past. We laughed at how the people sleeping below had no idea their lives rested on people like us. I looked at the lights and felt that this city was mine too now. I hadn't become a monster. I had become myself, someone who chooses whom to save and whom not to. I knew there was no way back from that choice. But I no longer felt torn. My body, my voice, my life, all of it belonged to me, not to other people's expectations. On our last night before dawn, we stood side by side on the roof. He held my hand and I felt his warmth. The city beneath us throbbed like a heart. We said nothing. In that silence was everything. Our past, our confessions, our choice. I knew we weren't heroes or victims. We were two people who had stopped pretending. I had stepped out of the white coat into the black suit. And for the first time in a long time, I felt alive instead of merely surviving. The city had become home, and his hand my anchor. We no longer sought excuses. We were simply together. And in the darkness we had chosen, there was enough light to breathe.